1984 was a big year for me. I got married twice to the same American man who was living in London at the time. On May the 12th, we got married on the Euston Road in a registry office. We came to the States. He interviewed in New Haven, I interviewed in New York, and on May the 19th, we got married again in the backyard at his parents' house in Bethesda, Maryland, by a cantor who agreed to marry us even though I wasn't converting. We then went back to London, where I was going to finish my master's degree, which I had decided to do after working for 7 years because I thought I might leave England and I would need it in order to carry on doing what I did. And if I didn't leave, I wanted to teach at the college level, so I would need it for that too. And then on September the 22nd, I left London to move here and join Stephen, who had moved back a month before, and we lived in our first apartment together on Orange Street in New Haven, just above the P&M, what is now the P&M Market. It used to be the Orange Market. It was actually not a difficult decision. I was probably the one who pushed harder for us to come back. Stephen had fallen in love with London, and I loved London too. It wasn't that I didn't love England, but 3 years before Stephen and I met, on the day after our first date, I got my visa through to move to Australia. I had decided I wanted to leave England. I loved England. I love England. I feel very English in many ways. I did feel very European. I would like still to have that feeling. But I love my friends. I love my family. I loved the countryside in England. I took walks, and the smell of leaves underfoot still comes back, all crunching across frosty meadows with somebody with a dog. Never a corgi, never my dog, but there was always a dog. And I loved London. I really loved London. It was terrific. But there were various things about England that didn't sit right with me, although it wasn't always so well organized. The first was the class system, which when I was growing up was absolutely fundamental to England. And it was feudal. I mean, it was so out of touch in that if you were married to somebody or if you were born to somebody who had at some point had some kind of relationship to one or other members of a royal family somewhere in Europe, then you were up there. Or if you happened to have been given land at some point, you were landed gentry and your family continued to have that kind of status. And then people sort of fell below that. And it was really pervasive. And I remember once being with my mother at the end of the road waiting for the bus to come. And we got on the bus and she said, "Did you hear that woman talking? She sounds so common." And I remember saying to her, "What do you mean she sounded common? What do you mean? You don't know her. You don't know her at all." But there was this judgment always. There was this sense of knowing where people fell. And it didn't matter whether you were a decent person or whether you were bright or not bright or whether you made a lot of money. It sort of locked you in. And one of the demarcators of that was your accent. And I have always loved accents. I'm a bit of an as-if person. If I'm around someone for a while with another accent, I find myself falling into it. I'm not trying to appropriate it, it just happens. And so for me, that was always a strange thing. It just felt uncomfortable. The irony being that when I moved here, unbeknownst to me, it ends up being this huge plus, which isn't earned at all. It has nothing to do with anything other than where I was born and who I happened to grow up around. But I could go through a McDonald's drive-through when my kids were going to soccer practice, and someone on the other end would imitate my accent, and I'd get to the window and they'd say, "I'm really sorry, but I love your accent. Where are you from?" And it would start these conversations. That was actually the plus. Or somebody would say, "I could listen to you all day," and I would think, "You really couldn't." You know, that A, it wouldn't be good, and B, I'd rather say a few really important things and have them valued for that. My closest friend in London was from Mexico. She was a PhD psychologist. You may at some point have met her because She moved to London to do her analytic training, and then she moved here for a while and worked at the Child Study Centre. And in London, people were really interested and wanted to know where she was from. And she moved here, and she would sometimes answer the phone in her house, and people would say, "Can I speak to the person who's the owner of the house?" And the idea that here, the accent is only in your favor, again, if you happen to be from a certain place. It was a different way of it impacting, but it still impacted. So there was the whole class thing. And then there was the chauvinism and misogyny, which was rife. It's not as though it's not happening elsewhere too. But growing up, most of the comedy had to do with wives being nagging wives or mothers-in-law. There was a huge amount of that. And I remember once with a friend going to the pub to join her husband before we went out for dinner. And he looked at us and he said, "What are you doing here? I wanted to be with my mates." So it was really strong, and it impacted expectations. So my parents cared about my education and encouraged learning and expected us to work hard. But they didn't especially think that my sister and I would go to college. The two things that were on their minds were maybe doing secretarial work or nursing. I think the secretarial idea, not that there's anything wrong with either of those things as professions, it was just interesting to me that that was about as far as they took it. The secretarial work was a throwback to, you know, you could be a secretary and then you'd get married and you wouldn't work anymore, which was certainly not what I had in mind for myself. The nursing, at least I understood, was what my mother had done and was an escape from her from a pretty dysfunctional family, including a schizophrenic mother. And it meant she could actually leave home and live in the nurse's home. So that made sense to me. I took my older son back when he was a baby to meet my parents, and we'd had lunch and we were taking a walk, and my father was pushing Alex in his stroller, and we were on a very busy thoroughfare in London that runs from North London down to the centre of London and South London, called the Finchley Road. And he was just uncomfortably close to where the road was for me as a young, maybe slightly anxious mum. And I said, "Dad, would you just mind pulling over a tiny bit, you know, away from the road?" Which he was fine with. And these two young men were walking by me. One of them turned around, shaved head, bother boots. He said, "Leave him the fuck alone." And I kind of did this, and I said, "It's none of your business." And I turned around, and my parents had disappeared. And this guy sort of took one step towards me, and I just walked off. But I wasn't meant to push back. And I thought to myself, gosh, it hasn't changed all that much. And the other piece of this sort of three-part problem I had was the issue of bigotry in England. Again, I know it's not limited to England, but England was where I grew up. It was the bigotry in England that I knew. It happened around race, and it happened around religion. So there was a lot of anti-Semitism, and there was a lot of racism. But my growing up, I went to 3 different schools. I went to a school in Derbyshire, which is in the Midlands, a Church of England school. Then we moved to Cheshire, which is next to Wales, and then we moved to Bedford. My Church of England school first, then a state, a public school, and then a sort of charter school. In my entire growing up, from preschool through high school, there were 3 women of color. They were visiting from other countries for a semester. There was a woman from Kenya, a woman from Nairobi, and a woman from Ghana. There were 2 women, 2 girls, who, as far as I knew too, were Jewish. I have no doubt there were other girls who were Jewish over the course of my time who didn't particularly announce it. One of them, strangely to me, was put in this Church of England school, although she was Orthodox. So she didn't come to our morning assemblies, but she did come to scripture classes that we had several times a week, and we were doing the Old Testament. No one ever asked her, what's your belief system? What are your traditions? How do you celebrate? Nothing. So most of my exposure to people who looked different from me in these communities that I lived in either had to do with my father and his love of jazz. He played jazz clarinet as a hobby. So I knew of jazz musicians. And he had spent time in the States and had actually loved it, training as a pilot at the end of the Second World War. So I knew about Glenn Miller and Ella Fitzgerald and Louis Armstrong and Fats Waller. I heard their music. But a huge amount of the exposure was from what was on television, and a lot of that was comedy. So Bill Cosby was one of the people I knew of. My father thought he was very funny. He would buy his EPs of his comic, stand-up comedy stuff. And the other thing that my parents watched was called the Black and White Minstrel Show. It was American gospel music by blackface singers. And it was on once a week. And I remember them watching it. And it was a big production, you know, it was a glossy sort of production. And then there was a comedy called Steptoe and Son, which was about a father-son relationship, these two Jewish men who collected rag and bones. So rag and bones, in my growing up, there was a rag and bone man who actually came down our street in with a horse-drawn cart, and he would yell rag and bone, and people would come out and give sheets or linens and any pots and pans they didn't want anymore. And the show was based on all of these tropes about people who were Jewish. When I met my husband, who was Jewish, at which point I had moved to London, which was the first place I spent time and felt like I gave a sigh of relief, where everybody did not look like me and there was much more of a range and exposure. When I met Stephen, and we decided we were going to get married, my closest friend, one of my closest friends, said to me, "That's great. And you know, he doesn't look Jewish." And I talked to her about it, but I found myself thinking in my growing up, because by then I was very sensitized to this, how many times have I said things like that, not realizing? How many times before have I said that very thing in a different situation? So we moved here. And I came with huge privilege. The biggest was I came by choice. Nobody took me somewhere I didn't want to leave. I didn't leave because I was fearful for my life or the lives of my kids. I didn't leave because I couldn't make enough money to put food on the table. I wanted to leave. I happened to have married Stephen at that point, and so I came in on a green card, and his parents sponsored me. They were thrilled that he was back after 5 years, and they were delighted I was coming. So I had a family who were welcoming me. I was white. I came from a country that was an ally and positive, and I had this accent, which, as I said earlier, who knew? I did not, for a minute, anticipate how unbelievably homesick I was when I got here. I'd visited, I had fallen in love with the country. I knew all the good and bad about my own country, and when I came here, I saw the good, which I felt very hopeful for. I thought the Constitution here seemed better to me than in England, and it seemed much further ahead in 1984 than England did in many ways. But I felt so foreign. I spoke the same language, and it felt more foreign to me here than going somewhere in Europe where I couldn't speak the same language. I realized that when you are somewhere, for good and bad, that's your home, you just know it in this deep way that things are recognized, there's a shared background experience. And I came here, and people would be talking about where they were from, or where they went to college, or they were just referencing places in New Haven, and nothing was familiar. And there are only so many times you can interrupt a conversation and say, could you just, because it, you know, it just dislocates it. And also in America, everyone uses acronyms all the time. I was like in meetings at the Child Study Center, and I thought, what are they talking about? Every other thing out of someone's mouth was an acronym, and I didn't recognize it. So anyway, I settled in, obviously. I had people who were phenomenally welcoming. The Child Study Center for me, there was a lot of great mentorship. I loved the work here. Mental health here was viewed in a much more comfortable way to me. It wasn't as stigmatized here, believe it or not, as it was there. So that was all good. I had my sons here. And 10 years in, I was leaving England to come back, and I suddenly realized for the first time, I felt as if I was coming home, not just leaving home. It wasn't that I didn't feel England was home. I just now felt both places I belonged in some way. And I thought I should take my citizenship exam. I should be voting. This is important. So I did the citizenship test. I didn't do the citizenship test. I took the citizenship course. And it was interesting and hard. And I thought, okay, so now I'm going to do the test. And I didn't do the test. I couldn't bring myself to get organized and sign the forms and put in the application. It makes no sense to me now. It made no sense then. I could have dual citizenship, I could keep my British passport, and I couldn't do it. And then in 2008 or 2007, it was clear to me that there was this big election coming. I wanted to vote for Obama. 9/11 had happened, and I got down to business. It was time, way overdue. It is embarrassing to me that I went that long without voting. Homeland Security was much more rigorous at that point because it was post 9/11. So there was a lot of fingerprinting, health checks, background checks. Had you been involved with any terrorist organizations? Had you ever been a communist? Had any of your family had criminal records? It was quite something. Everybody goes through that. And I have no doubt it is more rigorous for some people, without question. But I passed it, and what was amazing that day was in the room in Hartford, I walked in, and I don't think anybody spoke the same language. It was extraordinary being in that space. I felt as though this is it. And at the same time, I was aware of thinking, what is it like if you didn't come with all of the, by choice? What must it be like when you've got to learn this in a foreign language and learn about this way of governance that's nothing like anything you've done? So I got through it, and a few weeks later I got notification that I was going to have my naturalization ceremony in a courtroom in New Haven. And I sent out an email to a group of friends, because family were coming, telling them when it was going to be and saying, if you'd like to come, I'd love to see you. It's during a work day. Don't worry, I understand if you can't. But also, if you would just like to see what this ceremony is like if you haven't seen it before. And 15 people took time off work. It was amazing to me. And again, there was this very diverse group who came together for the ceremony. Only this time, people had brought their families, so they had their children and grandparents were with them. And so there was this real sense of the seriousness and enormity of this. And the judge walked in, and she was probably in her late 60s, Judge Ellen Peters. And she had us sit down and welcomed everybody and pointed out that this was a really serious thing that people were going to be doing. And then she spent maybe 5 to 6 minutes talking about the importance of holding on to the culture that you came from. She said, don't give up your language. Don't give up your traditions. Teach them to your children. Teach them the songs and tell them the stories, because it matters. And even though you're going to be saying this very serious oath, your history, what has already happened to you, shouldn't be something you feel you have to leave behind in your mind. And then she said, I can't do my job without you because I need a representative jury. When I am making decisions, I need a jury that look like you. And as she was talking, people handed out voter registration forms. She said, when you can, vote, and when you're called, come to be on the jury. And then she had us stand, and we read the Oath of Allegiance. And I'm going to read it now, because you may not know this unless you happen to have been to a ceremony, but you all live this. I hereby declare on oath that I absolutely and entirely renounce and abjure all allegiance and fidelity to any foreign prince, potentate, state, or sovereignty of whom or which I have heretofore been a subject or citizen, that I will support and defend the Constitution and the laws of the United States of America against all enemies, foreign and domestic, that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same, that I'll bear arms on behalf of the United States when required by law, that I will perform non-combatant service in the armed forces of the United States when required by law, that I will perform work of national importance under civilian direction when required by law, and that I take this obligation freely without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion. And then we said the Pledge of Allegiance. And again, what I found myself thinking was, how could anybody have no mental reservation? Especially when you are saying goodbye and I may never go back to my country and breathe that air and be with those people. And then she said, I will stay as long as you want. If you'd like photographs in the courtroom, I'm happy to have you come up and take photographs. Please bring your families. And everybody did. And apparently I was telling a friend I was going to be talking about this because she'd been there the other day, and she said, do you remember that the security guard actually came over to us and said, you know, you don't have to stay anymore. And no one wanted to leave. It had felt so powerful. And now, at this point in time, when both of my homes are in such a mess, and it seems to me that we are going backwards on both sides of the Atlantic in many of the things that I cared about to begin with, I think about this judge often and think about what she said to us, because I think that's really what I hope at some point we'll find our way to or back to. Thanks. Beautiful.
Any questions? What a perfect story for this moment in time. Thank you, Wendy. Wendy is open to some questions. So I'm interested in, what are you curious about in what you just heard?
I'm curious about so much. So much of what you said resonated with me.
You hear that accent too?
Yeah. As someone who's not taken her citizenship exam yet, and I've been here 22 years. So, what did your parents think about you coming over here? And what parts of your culture do you feel are alive for you still?
So my parents really were absolutely fine. My parents were not people who were able to be terribly close. So for them, they liked Stephen very much. My father had always loved America, so that felt good. And they actually only visited twice over the years. We would see them because we'd go back. So for them, this wasn't such a big deal. It was a big deal for my sister and I to be that far apart. And it is one of the things that I miss, was seeing my nieces growing up more consistently. And what still do I feel? Humor. The British sense of humor. I miss the fact that you can be irreverent but being really serious at the same time. I made the mistake at the Child Study Center once of making some small joke at a meeting, and I thought, oh, you don't do that in this country. I think the thing I feel is I can't live there. I couldn't live there anymore. I mean, I sometimes fantasize about it, but I would miss here. Here is home. My life is here. But I am aware when I go back and I'm in London, it just feels like I am where my heart is in some way.
Wendy, I'm interested, as you, from afar, looked at the United States, and as you thought about wanting to escape the way class misogyny was playing out in
England?
in England.
Yeah.
What it was like when you actually came here. So you saw it from afar, you had a vision of what you were coming to.
Right.
I'm wondering what it was like when you actually came here.
Well, first of all, I don't think at the time when I knew I didn't feel as though I quite fit there. But it wasn't as organized as I now realize. It was around the class thing. That was very clear to me. When I came here, I remember being in New York the first time, and first of all, it seemed much more mixed. I saw people of different races and ethnicities together more than I had in England. But I think I was naive. I don't think I certainly didn't fully appreciate the history here. I knew of it, but I didn't appreciate the depth to which it was institutionalized in the way the class system in England is. I think I felt more hopeful that it was more open. It felt like a younger country. I used to think it was almost like a teenager. You know, it had all of the energy and sometimes the impulsivity in making mistakes and could be difficult, but it felt like that to me. I remember thinking that a lot. I don't know that I was right, but the things that concerned me about England felt much more entrenched.
Are there other questions?
How do you feel now, having been here as long as you have? What I'm curious about is how you feel, or how much you appreciate now the difficulties that very much exist in terms of race and sex and class here.
Here, well, I think it's been a journey. It's a journey, you know. I think I was slow to learning a lot. I was very conscious of the anti-Semitic stuff just because Stephen's family were not religious, but that would come up quite often. And I think my understanding about and beginning to know issues around race has been a much slower, naive journey. I mean, I think I've been helped a lot. I think the CLP program helped me. But I was shocked that I hadn't known about things like redlining and the GI Bill for years. I really was shocked that I could live in this country that long. So I would say I think I'm still learning, and it's a journey, and I think there have been people who've been enormously generous when I've made mistakes along the way. I don't know if that answers your question.
Oh, yes.
It's not really related about the oath.
Yes.
Like, they need to update that.
You what?
They need to update that. They need to update that. Like, people are still using that same oath.
That's the one.
Wow.
Yep.
It's like, when was it written?
I know.
Slavery.
Shocking. I mean, it's interesting because when I think about the class system, this is like a feudal document, you know, potentate, and it is. Yeah.
It's just like the judge says, embrace your culture, bring it in.
Right.
And then you read a statement that says, let it go.
Well, what you're renouncing is allegiance, right? A specifically political thing. Or am I gonna get
It
that
is, but I think the reason sorry, go ahead.
The reason that resonated with me because even we still say Italian American, African American, Irish American, like you still have an allegiance of some kind. Like, okay, yes, I understand serving the country and all that, but like, it sounds like you gotta let go.
And lots of people, I think, do. So I think what she was trying, perhaps she also doesn't particularly like this document. Let's hope.
All right. Thank you so much,
Thank you.
Wendy. Please just